Good morning, Sabe. Today, Miss, we are starting Unit 6 and we are going to start with the reading text. Now, we will read from the student's book, pages 58 and 59. The title of our lesson is Mr. Duffy's Workshop. الآن في عندي رح نبدأ ب 58. Let's read together, Sabe. Grandfather wanted George to go to Mr. Duffy's house to collect a present. The present was for George's little cousin Sally. Mr. Duffy phoned this morning, grandfather told George. He is finished. Would you mind going now? George didn't mind going at all. He loved to go to Mr. Duffy's house at any time. He loved talking to Mr. Duffy about his work. Most of all, he was fascinated by Mr. Duffy's tools. خلينا نشرح سابع. Now grandfather wanted George. فإحنا في عنا الحفيد اللي هو جورج وفي عنا جده the grandfather. So grandfather wanted George to go to Mr. Duffy's house. Mr. Duffy is somebody who has a workshop, عنده ورشة. So he wanted him to go to Mr. Duffy's house to collect a present, to bring أو to pick up a present, لإحضار هدية. The present was for George's little cousin Sally. كانت cousin اللي هي معناها ابنة العم Sally. فأنا في عندي George and Sally, they are cousins. We have their grandfather جدهم, and their grandfather had a present for Sally that is made by Mr. Duffy. طيب Mr. Duffy phoned this morning. phoned يعني called أو أجرى اتصال. Grandfather told George he has finished doing the present or making Sally's present. Would you mind going now? الآن هنا عندي mind سابع لما تكون verb بيكون معناها يمانع يعني not to agree to do something. Would you mind to go now أو going now هل بتمانع إنك تذهب الآن؟ George didn't mind going at all because شوفي سابع هنا إنه هو ما مانع إنه يروح أبدا to Mr. Duffy's house because خلينا نشوف السبب. He loved to go to Mr. Duffy's house at any time because he loved talking to Mr. Duffy about his work, and most of all he was fascinated by Mr. Duffy's tools. Fascinated يعني كان مبهور فيها أو معجب بأدوات Mr. Duffy. So he was amazed and interested by them. طيب. A few minutes walk brought George to a tall house. He knocked on the old wooden door. After a few moments, Mrs. Duffy opened it. Come along, and George, she said. Mr. Duffy is in the workshop. She walked ahead of George along a short passageway and stopped at the open kitchen door. George caught a glimpse of bowls of plums and peaches on the kitchen table. A delicious smell of simmering fruit wafted past his nose. Miss Duffy pointed to an open doorway where bright sunlight fell across a single step. You know your way, don't you, George? خلينا نشرح سابع. Now a few minutes walk brought George to a tall house. فأخذت منه اللي هو بضع دقائق من المشي to go to Mr. Duffy's house, and it was a tall house. He knocked on the old wooden door, and after a few moments Miss Duffy opened it. Come along, and George, she said. Mr. Duffy is in the workshop. Workshop سابع اللي هو عنوان درسي معناها ورشة. So it is the place where people work. She walked ahead of George. Walk ahead يعني إنه هي مشت أمامه سبقته بالمشي along a short passageway. لا مدخل قصير. And she stopped at the open kitchen door. George caught a glimpse. الآن caught a glimpse سابع مرت معي بالفصل الأول. To catch a glimpse يعني إنه هو لمح هذا الإشي أو رآه لفترة قصيرة. He caught a glimpse of bowls زبادي أو أواني of plums and peaches. الآن في عندي plums سابع اللي هو الخوخ وفي عندي peaches اللي هي فاكهة الدرق. On the kitchen table. So he saw plums and peaches on the kitchen table. a delicious smell of simmering fruit. simmering سابع يعني إنه مطهو باستخدام الماء الساخن. So he was smelling كان في رائحة للفواكه المطبوخة بالماء الساخن. It wafted past his nose يعني مرت لأنفه. Miss Duffy pointed to an open doorway where bright sunlight fell across a single step. You know your way, don't you, George? سألته إنه هو بيعرف طريقه أو لا. طيب, let's continue. George nodded. Thank you, Miss Duffy, he said. So he nodded يعني أومأ برأسه إنه he knows his way. George stepped into the small courtyard, brilliant with flowers cascading in the streams of white, pink, and crimson from pots on the window sills. In one corner, a peach tree drooped its branches laden with golden fruit. Near the tree, a drawer stood open. George crossed the courtyard and stepped inside Mr. Duffy's workshop. This was one of George's favorite places in all the world, and Mr. Duffy was one of his favorite people. Now George stepped into the small courtyard. courtyard سابع يعني ساحة، فهو ذهب أو خطى لهاي الساحة. and that courtyard was brilliant with flowers. كانت مزينة أو it was amazing رائعة. اللي زينها اللي هي the flowers cascading in streams of white, pink and crimson. كان في عندي ألوان متعددة للفلاورز the white, the pink الأبيض والزهر and the crimson أو اللي هو اللون القرمزي. في عندي هون كلمة cascading سابع. cascading يعني إنها كانت الأزهار زي كأنها بتصب بنهر، يعني كانت متدلية زي كأنها زي كأنها ماء من نهر. So the flowers cascading from pots. pot اللي هو القصيص أو القوار on the windows sills. sills اللي هي الحواف، فهي عندي هون سابع اللي هي الويندو sills حافة الشباك. and we have pots of flowers. Here we have 3 pots of flowers. Okay, in one corner a peach tree. كان في عندي شجرة دراق. it drooped its branches. كانت منزلة أو متدلية لأغصانها. laden with golden fruit. laden يعني محملة بفواكه ذهبية، وهون احنا بنحكي عن لون اللي هو الدراق ببداية طلعته. Now near the tree, a door stood open and George crossed the courtyard and stepped into Mr. Duffy's workshop. This was the one of George's favorite places. Here سابع we are talking about the workshop. Mr. Duffy's workshop was one of George's favorite places من أماكنه المفضلة and Mr. Duffy was one of his favorite people. كان Mr. Duffy واحد من الأشخاص المفضلين عنده. Let's move to the next paragraph. Mr. Duffy was leaning over his workbench. On the wall beside him, clean but well-used screwdrivers, chisels, pliers of varying sizes were ranged in neat racks alongside hammers and saws. Rows of tiny paint pots and varnish stood on narrow shelves with fine, delicate brushes in long plastic boxes and pots of screws and nails. Mr. Duffy's glasses were perched on the end of his nose, and he was looking carefully at a thick piece of wood. He ran his long fingers gently over the surface. He was frowning a little with an air of concentration. He scrutinized the wood for a few seconds. Then he stood up straight with an expression of satisfaction. At that moment, he noticed George and turned towards him with a welcoming smile. Now Mr. Duffy was leaning over. leaning over يعني كان بنحني تجاه his workbench. workbench is a table to work on اللي هي طاولة مخصصة للعمل عليها. On the wall beside him, هنا هم بترجع لمستر دافي، في على الحائط بجانبه there were clean and well used. clean يعني نظيفة، لكن هاي الأدوات كانت مستخدمة. هسا سابع بده يعدد لي هاي الأدوات. we have the screwdrivers. screwdriver اللي هو المفك. the chisel بدون اس الجمع اللي هو الإزميل. and we have the plier اللي هي الكماشة. of varying sizes. هدول الأدوات الثلاثة they were of varying sizes أحجام مختلفة أو أحجام متنوعة. And they were arranged in neat racks alongside hammers and saws. كانوا مرتبين أو موضوعين بطريقة مرتبة على racks اللي هي the shelves الأرفف، فكانوا موجودين على أرفف مرتبة alongside يعني with hammers and saws. hammer سابع اللي هي المطرقة and the saw اللي هي بحالة المفرد اللي هو المنشار. Now rows of tiny paint pots. rows يعني صفوف من آنية الدهان أو علب الدهان and varnish stood on narrow shelves with fine delicate brushes. يعني كانت موجودة هاي العلب مع بعض الفراشي اللي كانت fine and delicate. fine and delicate يعني كان الشعر فيها رقيق. in long plastic boxes and pots of screws and nails. screws and nails سابع اللي هي السكروز لحالها اللي هو البراغي، nails اللي هي المسامير. Now Mr. Duffy's glasses were perched on the end of his nose. perched يعني they were placed كانوا موضوعين at the end. نظاراته كانت موضوعة على نهاية أنفه يعني كان منزلهم سابع. and he was looking carefully at a thick piece of wood. كان بتفحص قطعة من الخشب خميلة. it was thick. He ran his long fingers كان بمرر أصابعه gently over the surface. surface لما نحكي the surface of the wood يعني على سطح هاي القطعة. He was frowning سابع يعني كان عابس، بس هذا العبوس ما كان من الغضب. he was frowning with an air of concentration يعني to focus on something تركيز، فهو كان عابس من شدة التركيز. and he scrutinized the wood. scrutinized يعني he tested it كان بيختبرها أو بتفحصها for a few seconds. then he stood up straight with an expression of satisfaction يعني رضا، يعني كان بتفحص هاي القطعة وبعد ما انتهى كان عنده نظرة رضا عليها، بمعنى انه كان راضي عن اللي هو the surface of the wood. At that moment he noticed George and turned towards him with a welcoming smile. طيب let's move now to page 58. The most striking thing about Mr. Duffy was that he was extremely tall. The second most striking thing was that he was extremely thin. This always surprised George as he never came to the house without smelling something delicious cooking on the stove. He wondered how Mr. Duffy stayed so thin when so much tasty food was produced from Miss Duffy's kitchen. Mr. Duffy peered at George over the rims of his glasses, and he had a large nose above a pointed chin and a broad forehead with thick dark eyebrows. His short graying hair stood straight up from his head, and he seemed to George like a wise old bird, sharp-eyed and thoughtful. He always wore a long blue apron, which made him look even taller and thinner. In the pocket was a short pencil, which he sharpened from time to time with a tiny pen knife. Now the most striking سابع يعني attracting attention، إشي ملفت للنظر أو إشي مميز أو غريب. Now the most striking thing about Mr. Duffy was that he was so tall أو extremely tall. extremely بمعنى very tall. So he was tall and also he was extremely thin. كان طويل ونحيف. This always surprised George as he never came to the house. لأن إنه يكون مستر دافي نحيف وطويل كان هذا الإشي بيفاجئ جورج because he never came to the house without smelling something delicious cooking on the stove. بمعنى إنه كان مستغرب منه لأنه ما كان يجي على البيت إلا وتكون في روائح لطبخ إشي شهي بالفرن. So he wondered how Mr. Duffy stayed so thin when so much tasty food was produced from Mrs. Duffy's kitchen. Produced يعني it was made or cooked. Now Mr. Duffy peered at George. Peered يعني نظر. He looked at him over the rims of his glasses. rims اللي هي the edges of the glasses من حواف النظارات. He had a large nose above a pointed chin. الآن في عندك هاي الصورة سابع اللي بتبين لك أجزاء الوجه. الآن في عندي he had a large nose above a pointed chin. chin اللي هي اللحية أو الدقن and it was pointed يعني كانت محددة أو دقيقة and a broad forehead. forehead اللي هي الجبين. So Mr. Duffy had pointed chin and a broad forehead with thick dark eyebrows. eyebrows اللي هي الحواجب. His short gray hair اللي هو الشعر الشايب stood straight up from his head. He seemed to George like a wise old bird. wise سابع يعني حكيم. كان بيظهر بمظهر الحكيم لجورج. He had sharp eyes and thoughtful. كان في اللي هو thoughtful بمعنى he was full of thoughts. He always wore a long blue apron. apron سابع اللي هو المريلة أو المريول which made him look even taller and thinner. In the pocket was a short pencil. In the pocket يعني بجيبة هذا المريول there was always a short pencil which he sharpened يعني كان ببريه أو بحدده from time to time with a tiny pen knife and you can see سابع the pen knife in the picture. Let's move to the last paragraph. Hello George, said Mr. Duffy. Hello Mr. Duffy, replied George. replied بمعنى رد. Mr. Duffy beckoned George to a table against one wall. أشار له لطاولة بعكس أو مقابل واحد من الجدران. This was the table where Mr. Duffy put finished pieces of work. كانت هاي الطاولة المكان اللي بيحط فيها مستر دافي the finished pieces القطع اللي منتهية من العمل يعني الأشغال الخشبية اللي هو مخلصها أو منجزها. Now there was a large polished box made of gold colored wood and a small round table with intricately carved legs. يعني كان في عندي اللي هي large polished box كان في عندي صندوق كبير وملمع أو مدهون and it was made of gold colored wood مصنوع من الخشب المدهون أو الملون باللون الذهبي and a small round table طاولة مدورة with intricately بدقة carved legs أرجلها كانت محفورة أو منحوتة بشكل دقيق. intricately تاسع أو سادس اللي هي not simple غير معقدة عفوا غير بسيطة أو بمعنى معقد. Now beside the table was Sally's present. كان في عندي هدية سالي the one that George went to Mr. Duffy in order to collect. It was a small wooden boat. كانت هديتها عبارة عن قارب صغير خشبي. Across the middle of the boat were 3 little benches and each bench had 3 holes. بداخل أو بمنتصف هذا القارب there were 3 little benches. benches يعني seats أو كراسي خشبية and each bench had 3 holes in. يعني كان في عندي زي الكراسي الخشبية اللي احنا شايفينهم بالصورة وكل واحد منهم كان فيه 3 حفر يعني بكل صف من المقاعد كان في عندي 3 حفر. Now in each hole بكل حفرة there was a small round wooden sailor with a blue body. كان في عندي بداخل هاي الحفرة بحار خشبي يعني مجسم خشبي لبحار. A round head and tiny sailor hat. hat كان بيوصف لي إياه إنه it has a blue body, round head and tiny sailor hat. They looked as though they were sitting on the benches. كان منظرهم مع الحفرة زي كأنهم جالسين بهاي المقاعد. They looked as though they were sitting on the benches. Mr. Duffy lifted one of these sailors. Lifted يعني رفعه أو حمله and showed it to George. The sailor had dark hair. لون شعره كان غامق. Rosy cheeks. التشيك اللي هو الخد. And a curly mustache. mustache اللي هو الشارب. He was winking in a very cheeky fashion. Winking يعني كان بغمز in a very cheeky fashion. Cheeky fashion يعني in a funny way. Now George laughed. He looked at the other sailors. All their faces were different. Some were old and some were young, but they all looked friendly and cheerful. Cheerful يعني they looked happy. George grinned at Mr. Duffy and he said, Sally is really going to love this. He said, grinned سابع يعني he said it with excitement. يعني قال بحماس إنه سالي رح تحب هاي الهدية. And by that سابع we have reached to the end of our class today. Thank you for watching and have a great day.